Today, on this episode, we have a guest. We have John Meade. John is a professor of Old Testament at Phoenix Seminary. He's also the co-director of the Text and Canon Institute, and he's written a bunch of helpful books on the canon, canon lists, the history of the canon, all that type of stuff. And so we're really glad to have you on the show. Thanks for joining us, John.
Yeah, Brian, thanks for having me. Good to be here.
Well, before we started recording, I was just complimenting you on this nice backdrop you have of all these books. And it's a great, every scholar needs to have that backdrop, right? And so I'm impressed with yours, and also just grateful for the time that you're spending with us on a topic that I think is really, really interesting. Mm-hmm. And that's specifically about Old Testament canon, and even more specifically about the fact that Roman Catholic Bibles are a little heavier than Protestant Bibles because they've got 7 more books and some additions to Daniel and Esther. Mm-hmm. And they have this collection that people refer to as, I guess, the apocryphal books or the deuterocanonical books or something like that. But I remember looking into the subject, and it's a little perplexing. You're kind of like, why is it that Christian traditions differ on books of the Old Testament? And it's a bit of a strange kind of thing to look into, but very, very interesting. And thankfully, you have done a lot of great scholarly work on this topic, and that's why you're here. And so I'm just curious, your own story, what got you interested in studying the canon and putting some scholarship into that?
Yeah, that's great. So my academic chops background is kind of in the area of Old Testament textual criticism. So I've always had an interest in manuscripts and differences between the Hebrew Bible and the Septuagint, right? So the Septuagint, right, the translation, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. So very early on, getting into that, just kind of got my wheels going, as well as kind of like this scenario right now. When I was in seminary, I went to Southern Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky. They had an undergraduate college. And what's fascinating is all these undergraduates had these same questions. Surprise, surprise. Like, how did we get the Bible?
Yeah.
And they kind of, I don't know how it is. They kind of came, many of them came to me and asked those questions. I think because they knew I was, into the manuscripts and the languages. But to be honest with you, I had not really at that point delved into the canon question. I had read some books, very good books, that were kind of detailing the history of the Hebrew canon. And then fast forward, I was teaching a class at Phoenix Seminary on the canon in 2014, 2015, something like this. And I realized, to my shame, I had never looked at a real canon list before, Brian. So a canon list, for those who don't know, this would be an author or council's opinion on which books are divinely inspired, and the books are listed. I like to talk about them as the earliest table of contents to the Bible, okay? Because the titles of the books would just be listed out. And if you're reading a book, an introduction to the biblical canon, say something by Lee MacDonald, he's just a popular name in this discussion, or a book called The Canon Debate, which was published, I think, in 2002. There's an appendix at the back of the Canon Debate book that just has lists upon lists of books. And I realized, though, that by reading those lists, I was not actually reading a canon list. And this was the hard truth, because what happened is I started to look up the primary sources in preparation for this class, and I realized that there was a whole lot of text and description and discourse about the books in the list. So scholarship for almost 100 years has only been content to list, say, the books that Athanasius, the church father, we'll talk about him a lot here, that Athanasius believed were in the canon. And they would just list the books that Athanasius listed, but they would omit all of the commentary that Athanasius was giving about these books. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And so that's what really kind of set me off. And I realized that for whatever reason, scholarship had become content with just listing the books. and not actually providing the full extant text of the canon list, you see. And so my co-author in that the canon list book, Edmund Gallagher, he and I became fast friends. And Ed is he is like an off the charts kind of canon scholar. He's brilliant, but he and I teamed up and wanted to record the original language of every one of those lists: Greek, Latin, Syriac, Hebrew. In the case of the Jewish list from the Talmud, Baba Bathra. And so that's in there with English translation, right, in parallel columns, so that you could see for the first time, but for the first time in a long time, you could see the full text of these sources. So that's what really got me interested in this. I was like, at first, canon lists, they sound boring. It's like, again, it looks like a table of contents, and you're like, what is so important about this? But it's the way in which the list of books is framed, the way it's introduced and concluded, and sometimes commentary in the middle. That's the most interesting part, but that's the part that scholarship for almost 100 years was not reporting on, if I can put it that way. You might get a little comment here or there, but no systematic treatments about this. So that's how I got into it. And once I started going down that big rabbit hole, Brian, it was hard to pull me back. So honestly, it started with students asking me questions that I had no answers for. And then I started to do my own digging. And then I realized, oh, okay, there really is some like scholarly work to do here on these canon lists. So we don't just put the original language and the translation. Obviously, there's deep footnotes providing commentary as well on the various aspects and of the lists themselves. So
it was immensely helpful, that book. I mean, it really is, when you can see the commentary around it, even just how some of the authors are distinguishing between books that are private, books that are public, books that are helpful, spurious. It's the nuance is crazy.
Yeah.
And but it's such a great resource, because I remember being like, you listen to the debates about it, you read texts, and they're quoting all these things. I'm like, what is that?
Yeah.
And you have to go like Google it and find it on some obscure website and get the PDF or something like that.
That's
and it was
right.
all
That's right.
here, and it's all consistent.
Yeah.
And that was a really, really helpful resource that you put together.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about these deuterocanonical books.
Let's do it.
These 7 books, and there's additions to Esther, Daniel.
Yep.
And then there's, I guess, Baruch in addition to Jeremiah, and then you've got Tobit, Judith. I might be missing. You got the Maccabees, first and second Maccabees.
Yep.
Sirach,
Yep.
And Wisdom of Solomon, and Judith and Tobit, and all of that. So
right.
There are these books that are floating around, and how do we make sense of them? So why do we could go so many different angles, but how do we understand the story about how these books started to emerge, and why the Protestant stream and the Catholic stream deviate on accepting these books as canonical?
Yeah, these are the big questions. But I think it's first, I think, helpful to point out that these so-called deuterocanonical books, we'll get to this part in the story later. They're called deuterocanonical way late in the story. Even in the modern period, okay? So I'll come back to that term, deuterocanon, here in a second. It's really helpful to point out that they are books written by Jews, to start with. They're Jewish books. We tend to think of them, I think, as because the Jews never included them in their canon. So that's maybe step one. But Jews in the Second Temple period, so sometime between when the Jews came back from Babylon, came back from exile, all the way up until the destruction of the temple in AD 70. Okay, these books were written. Okay, and I don't think they were ever really thought of as a single corpus. So some Jewish pockets would have had them, others would not have had them, or this one or that one. They don't really become a collection of books until much, much later, you see. Well, we can maybe talk about that too. But they're Jewish books, Many of them written in Greek primarily. So a book like Wisdom of Solomon, a book like Second Maccabees, clearly composed in Greek. Okay, but now we know a book like Ben Sira, or in a Catholic Bible, it's called Ecclesiasticus. This book was originally written in Hebrew, we know now. And it was later translated into Greek, and that's how most of us have access to that book, okay, is through Greek, and then, of course, its subsequent translations. You know, the jury's still out on some of these books. First Maccabees probably was a Hebrew book, but we don't know. That one we don't know. We have found fragments of Tobit in Hebrew from the Dead Sea Scrolls. So the question is, was Tobit originally in Hebrew or not? You know, there's some questions about that. So to me, like, I want to take the beginning part of that story seriously. They're Jewish books, which is what explains why later Christians will disagree over these, because they were originally written by Jews. It's not like they were written by Christians, and then other Christians advocating for their canonicity, right? This is different than a book like The Shepherd of Hermas, say, for the New Testament canon, right? Which was clearly written by a Christian, Hermas probably, and then there were, you know, there could have been some debates and disputes about whether that book would be canonical or not at the end, but that's not the case here. These are long-standing books written by Jews. Okay, so how do we think about this, right? If they were written by Jews, then why wouldn't we just immediately bring them into the Old Testament canon, right? That's the big question. Well, I think an initial point is those books seemingly were never adopted into the Jewish canon, the Hebrew canon, you see. So that immediately becomes a question in the early church. Would these books, should these books become part of the Christian Old Testament canon if they were never included in the Hebrew canon? Okay. This becomes known, and I could talk about this one forever, Brian, so you're going to have to cut me off, but this becomes known as a Hebrew canon criterion. That is a standard of Christians were only going to adopt books into the Old Testament, or recognize as canonical books of the Old Testament that Jews had already included in their canon. Does that make sense? Okay. So Protestants, fast forwarding, automatically adopt this criterion. Okay. Protestants adopt the Hebrew canon, but not quite so simply, but let's just say that for now. They adopt the Hebrew canon. And there's really good reasons for that. Let's talk about a canon list from a lesser-known figure, someone named Melito of Sardis, okay, around 170. He wants to list the books of the law and the prophets, because apparently he and some of his fellow bishops were puzzled by what books belong, and what were the names of the books, and then what was the order of the books. Okay, so it says he was in Sardis, which is in modern day Turkey, and he takes a journey back east, probably to the land of Israel, and he wants to connect with Christian brothers there, and get information like what is the list of books that we should have. And what's interesting is he comes back and he reports this list of books, and his table of contents, except for Esther is omitted, or at least the list lacks Esther. But for the most part, the list mirrors the Hebrew canon, you see. It doesn't include any of the deuterocanonical books. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, yeah. So, and that's our earliest evidence for canon, for the Old Testament canon, received by early Christians. Okay, and so many have looked at this as to say, okay, from the beginning, early Christians adopted a Hebrew canon criterion. They only received books that the Jewish canon had already received. Okay, and so that gets us kind of off and running. And if you look at the lists, the canon list in that book that we talked about, the biblical canon list from early Christianity, 11 after Melito 11 Greek canon lists basically fall into that pattern. And they only accept books that were in the Hebrew canon. They don't include the deuterocanonical books. This was one of the more surprising things that I found in the course of this research. I thought, just naively, that I might find the Council of Trent's, right, the Roman Catholic Council of Trent's list kind of in all of these other early canon lists. And I was stunned to discover that that very few, that no Greek lists, no early Greek lists include those books. So so I think that's really kind of important to say on the front end as we're talking about the canon. So how do the deuterocanonical books, so-called, become included, right? I think that's maybe the big question. But do you have any follow-ups on that first part? Maybe we
No, I mean, I think that's so. In these debates or discussions, there's often there's two sort of surface level approaches I see. The one is that Martin Luther didn't like purgatory,
right.
and purgatory, or at least the seed that develops
Right.
into purgatory,
Right.
is in 2 Maccabees 12 or whatever that verse is.
That's it.
And so Luther takes his scissors and he cuts it out. And while he's at it, he just cuts out James. Okay,
That's
so
it.
and he does that over and against 1,500 years of unanimous consent to the acceptance of these books as canonical.
That's right.
And then in seminary, I mean, the Protestant answer was, well, no, they were adopting the Hebrew canon.
Yes.
And then I think the level beneath that is the Catholic response is there was no Hebrew canon.
Yes.
They didn't close the Hebrew canon. In fact, when they did, it was in response to Christianity because everybody used the Septuagint. Jesus used the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, and that contained all those books. And that's sort of that's like the firing back.
That's right. That's right. Okay. But we can, I think, I do think scholarship, there are some outliers, right? It's scholarship. There's never a monolithic thing going on here.
Sure.
But a consensus is the Jewish canon is probably closed by the 1st century AD. Okay. Now, even in my own writings, because I've written on the Esther, there's a bit of a question about Esther, and not just the editions that you've referred to, like just the book of Esther. Was that book adopted early or recognized early on by Jews as canon? I always say this: it's possible, but remember, there were no copies of Esther found amongst the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is unusual because tons and tons of copies of books were found amongst the Dead Sea Scrolls, but so far no biblical copy of Esther found there. And then, like I said with Melito, there are a few early Christians that don't list Esther amongst the canonical books, and I think what that's doing is reflecting some early Jewish disputes about that book. But that said, no one is doubting that there is a core, more than a core canon, really, of the Hebrew canon by the 1st century AD. Okay, so I think we can pretty much put to rest that the Jews were responding to the Christians, right? This kind of thing. Let me go back to that Hebrew canon criterion for a moment. Some have asked, where does that come from? I think the seed is actually in Romans 3, verse 2, because Paul asks the church there in Rome, what advantage is there to being a Jew, right? And of course he says much in every way, but the first thing he says is that the Jews possess the oracles of God. So the idea is, I think if you asked, if a Gentile Christian in the church at Rome had a question about what books belong to the Old Testament or the Hebrew Scriptures, right? What's the collection look like? I think the Jewish believer in that church would say, let's go down to the synagogue and check it out. You know what I mean?
Right.
So in other words, there's already within the middle of the first century a notion that the Jews possess these oracles. They possess the scriptures. And if you want to know what they are and how many there are, you go down to the synagogue and you check it out, right? Okay. So to me, that already signals like Christians are going to follow the Jews in terms of what books are considered inspired, what books are considered canon, right? These sorts of things. Also, we should not leave out Josephus at this point as well. So if you fast forward 60 years, 50, 60 years from, say, the time of Romans was written up to Josephus around 95 AD, already tells his debate partner Apion, okay, he says, look, Jews have for a long time only ever had 22 books. And he means 22 divinely inspired books, okay? And he says every Jew knows them by their names, like from a very young age, you know? And now that scholars have disputed, you know, like whether Josephus is 100% accurate, you know, in his statement that every Jew. So in other words, could we put the Jew from the Dead Sea Scrolls, right, from Qumran on the stand, and would he say, yeah, we only have 22? We don't know for sure. I think it's pretty clear Josephus doesn't include Samaritans here. Samaritans did have a different canon, of course. They only held to the first 5 books of Moses. That's pretty clear. But I think Josephus is probably, like, you know, mostly right here, that all Jews everywhere have really only had 22 books, okay? And if that's true, then by the end of the first century, the Jewish canon is already being considered closed, okay? And we're not going to be adding or taking away from this corpus, okay? It's been a little while since I've read some of the Roman Catholic apologists. I don't know what they say about Josephus, but I do know what scholarship thinks about Josephus, and the testimony is like pretty solid, you see. So it's hard to get around like those kinds of primary sources if you're going to try to advance a much, much later date to the closing of the Hebrew canon, you see.
I think some of it, I know, centers around that the Christian church, comprised largely of Jews in the beginning, used the Septuagint, which included the Deuterocanonicals, which so then doesn't matter what Josephus says because he's not a Christian.
Okay. Then so that's my next point. I'm glad you circled back to that. All right. So here's a problem. Actually, I'm gonna highlight 2 problems. The Septuagint is a modern title. So Septuagint is already an abbreviation of the Latin term Septuaginta, which means 70. Okay. So in other words, and if you look in all of the earliest sources talking about Jewish Greek translators of the Hebrew Scriptures, there are 70 translators that are only responsible for translating the Hebrew Torah into what we call the Greek Pentateuch. Okay, so the first 5 books of Moses. We could look at Philo, Josephus, the early descriptions of the work of those translators from the letter of Aristeas, which is BC. Okay, that's quite an old document. And then also the earliest Jewish commentaries on this from the Talmud. All of them report those 70 translators are responsible only for the first 5 books of the Old Testament, okay, of the Hebrew Bible.
Interesting. Okay.
Yes. So in fact, we can document the first time the 70, so not even the Septuagint, right? Because the Septuagint, right, sounds like a corpus of its own, right? Like a closed corpus that maybe a committee or 2 were responsible for putting together, you know. But the reality is nothing like that ever happened. So the Septuagint is a misnomer, but the first time the 70 are described as translating the entire Old Testament is Justin Martyr. when he's talking with Trypho in his dialogue in the middle of the 2nd century AD. He's the first one on record to say the entire law, and by nomos, by law here, he extends that to the Old Testament, was translated by the 70.
It wasn't as though Jesus and the apostles, they go to their local synagogue and they pull out this book called Septuagint.
Right.
And it just has the whole Old Testament there.
Correct. They certainly wouldn't have had it all between two covers, right? So at best, what they're able to do is go down to a synagogue, especially if like Paul, right? Paul's maybe a better example here. If he's in the diaspora, right? He's outside of Israel, outside of Jerusalem. He visits the local synagogue of Corinth, and he basically says, "Hey, guys, I need to access your manuscript of Isaiah, because they probably don't have a bunch of them, right? Just maybe it's only 1 or 2 copies, and it would be in Greek." And so part of the question is even, was it the original Septuagint or the original Old Greek translation that the church or that the synagogue in Corinth was using? Maybe not. Maybe it had already gone through some later revision and this sort of thing. Because we do know that now about the Septuagint. The wording itself was revised through time. Okay. And there are definitely some places in Paul's quotations of some books where his quotations do not reflect the oldest Greek translation that we can reconstruct. His text reflects, we now know, a later revision of that older text. Do you follow? So to use an analogy, like if you're a KJV onlyist, like you're kind of upset about this because you never use the revisions, right? You always go back to that original English translation from the 1611,
Right.
and but Paul's actually quite happy to use the Revised Standard Version, so to speak. Okay, and so anyhow, so the Septuagint is the biggest misnomer here, and it's not, and it applies to the text issue, but it also applies to the canon issue, Brian. There's actually here's my big point here. There's no such thing as the Septuagint canon. No such thing. No such thing. Canon is a separate thing. Greek translations of the Hebrew Bible is another thing. Okay. The only instances we have of those Greek translations put together in one cover come from the 4th and 5th centuries AD. Okay. In Codex Sinaiticus, Codex Vaticanus, and then in the 5th century Codex Alexandrinus. They're the only 3 manuscripts that we have that put all those Greek translations together, which means ultimately they are later Christian creations. So that's my first point. There's no such thing as the Septuagint canon. I am convinced if you asked Peter, John, James, Paul, Jesus himself, whether we should consult the translation of the 70, they would say, sure. Which of the 5 books, Genesis through Deuteronomy, should we look at? Do you see what I mean? They would never, in the 1st century, ever think to look at, say, the Greek translation or the Septuagint translation of Isaiah. It would never cross their minds to do that.
But do they quote from the Septuagint with regard to Isaiah?
So what I'm going to say is they quote from a Greek translation sometimes, yes. But that's a complicated issue because not all the New Testament authors quote from just the Greek translation, the oldest Greek translation of the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. They don't do it. For example, this just muddies the waters, but I think we have to muddy the waters on this issue, especially if there's an apologist who's kind of coming at this thinking, oh yeah, this is just a clear, pure, kind of easy story to tell. No. So Matthew 2:15. When Matthew quotes Hosea 11:1, out of Egypt I called my son, he is not quoting the oldest Greek translation of Hosea there. No way. Because that has something like he summoned my children. It's a plural. which of course is not what Matthew's argument rests on here.
Right.
The argument here has to be that Matthew, I shouldn't say has to be, there's two possibilities. Matthew could make his own Greek translation from the Hebrew. St. Jerome actually makes that argument. Jerome believed Matthew made his own Greek translation from the Hebrew of Hosea 11 verse 1. So that's very possible. The second option is, remember I was talking about these revisions, these Jewish Greek revisions that were kind of circulating already by the time the gospel writers sat down to write. It's very possible that Matthew already had a Greek copy of Hosea 11 verse 1 that differed from the oldest translation, right? But it had already been revised according to the Hebrew. And so he winds up with, out of Egypt I called my son. So do you see what I'm saying? So there's sort of two possibilities, but both of them come back to the oldest Septuagint Greek translation being revised according to the Hebrew. Okay. So sometimes the New Testament authors do make use of the oldest Greek translations. They don't oftentimes disagree with the Hebrew, so there's not really a point of contention there. I could maybe think of one place where I think the meaning changes, but not so drastically. You're probably aware of Amos 9 being quoted in Acts 15, right, at the Jerusalem Council. Yeah. But even here, you would never spot it if you were just comparing English translations. But even here, Luke's copy of Amos already reflects slight later revision of the original of Amos. So I can't even say that Luke is quoting the oldest Greek translation. He's actually quoting a revised version of it. But the revision still contains the big difference, right? Whether it's the remnant of Edom or the remnant of humanity, right? So those are the two differences. For those who don't know Hebrew, right? Edom, our English word Edom comes right from the Hebrew Edom. Okay, so these are the descendants of Esau. Yes, but the Hebrew word for humanity is Adam. Adam, right. Which means humanity. And the consonants, Aleph, Daleth, Mem, in Edom are exactly the same as the consonants for Adam, Aleph, Daleth, Mem, you see. So it's not a consonantal issue, it's a vocalization issue there. That's the biggest change. The verb is a little bit different, whether they're seeking or whether they're being dispossessed. That's the other kind of big issue there. That's a little bit more complicated, but I'm happy to talk about that. That's a textual issue, though. Has zero to do with the canon, okay, or anything like that. So there are times where New Testament authors do make use of a Greek translation that it doesn't easily square with the Hebrew, okay? But it's not as foreign as it maybe seems. Once you delve into how textual variants occur in manuscripts, and then how a textual variant could be translated into Greek that way. Okay. This is not earth-shattering. It's certainly not faith-shattering. Okay. I want to put it that way. So, okay. No Septuagint canon. The first people to put the Old Testament and New Testament as well, but the Old Testament in between two covers with some of these Jewish apocrypha or deuterocanonical books happened in the 4th, 5th century, right? In those three manuscripts that I mentioned. But let me be clear about this. Even in these three manuscripts, these books, these deuterocanonical books, are not treated as a singular corpus. In fact, across the three manuscripts, only 4 of the books are contained, like across all three.
That are consistent across all three.
Yeah. Sorry, I mean consistent. Yeah, and it's Tobit, Judith, Wisdom of Solomon, and that book Ben Sira or Ecclesiasticus. Okay, so only those 4 books can be found in all 3 of those codices. The Maccabees are scattered. I'm trying to remember. I don't even 1st and 2nd Maccabees aren't even in Codex Vaticanus. They're not even in
Hmm.
there. Okay, and that's
Interesting.
a really, really important manuscript, right? But they're not even in there. If I'm this is off the top of my head, Sinaiticus has First Maccabees and 4 Maccabees, I believe it is. It does not have Second or Third Maccabees. Okay, so anyone who says that the contents in that manuscript equal a canon are wrong, because the canon lists and the contents there, and right, and an author's telling us, right, this is the canon, yeah,
Yeah. Right.
never align fully with the contents of a manuscript. Okay,
Do the
this is
people who
where I
compiled those think that that was the canon, even though they disagreed? Do they think that, oh, Tobit, they're canonical?
no, that's what I'm saying. I don't think they did.
Okay.
I think manuscripts were very costly to make, right? Just the sheer raw skins it took, right, for the writing surface alone, super costly. So I think what's going on, and this might get us to the next topic here, is in a book, in a codex like Vaticanus, where 4 of those deuterocanonical books are included, the compiler and the user of that codex are already thinking in terms of, okay, we've got our canonical books, and we also have our devotional edificatory books. Okay, because the reason I say this is because if you're gonna do all this like one time or 2 times, let's just get it done. We're gonna put it all together in one volume. But the canon list is the interpretive key to the contents in that volume.
Hmm.
Our readers should know this, because the Roman Catholic apologist doesn't make this very clear. They just say, see, Tobit's in the manuscript, therefore Tobit is in the canon.
Right.
well, no. Yes, Tobit is in the manuscript, but the scribe does not say, by the way, Tobit is in the canon.
Huh.
The scribe also doesn't say, by the way, Tobit's not in the canon. The point is, the scribe doesn't give you any commentary on Tobit's status in this manuscript. It's just there. But all of the canon lists in Greek never include Tobit in the canon. And those
Interesting.
other lists that, like Athanasius, that go further, they talk about how Tobit is not canonized, but Tobit is able to be read, right? So in other words, there's a tier there, right? There's a distinction. Okay.
Hmm.
So the manuscript is, I think scholars have applied sloppy interpretations of contents of manuscripts over the years. And that's kind of fueled some of these Roman Catholic arguments about the early adoption of the Septuagint canon, which included these, deuterocanonical books. But if I don't grant these apologists a Septuagint canon at the beginning, which I don't, there's no evidence that the Jews even collected all of these books, you see, into one place. The only place that you've got collections of these translations are the 4th, 5th century Christian manuscripts. There are, or I should back up though. There are earlier papyri manuscripts, say 3rd century, maybe second or late 2nd, 3rd century. There is like a grouping, say, of Esther, Daniel, and Ezekiel in a manuscript. Okay, so there are some manuscripts that show connections between books, but by and large, the manuscripts contained one book and one only. Okay, so I look at that and go, no one was really thinking in terms of like showing groupings or something like this early on. Later on, that happens, but early on, that was not happening. And all of our evidence, I should be careful here. I think most all of our evidence is Christian, not Jewish. Okay. So, anyways, that's what I want to say about there being no Septuagint canon. And then I can't look at an ancient codex and say, here's a canon. That doesn't work either. This is so simple, it pains me to say it every time in these sorts of venues. If you want to know what an early Christian thought was in the canon, you go to the canon list. Right? Like, simple. Like, you want to know what the canon is, go to the canon list. Don't try to track down all of their citations of different books where they call, a certain citation like scripture or something like that. I mean, you can do that, and that's occupied scholars for decades here, You can do that, but you wind up with really weird syntheses. Like, well, Athanasius seems to refer to Ben Sira as scripture in a place or two. But again, when Athanasius of Alexandria comes around and lists all of the canonical books, Ben Sira is not among the canonical books. So I trust what he says in his canon list, and I just say that he could also refer to other books outside of the canon even, right, as scripture. We tend to equate canon and scripture. The ancients had a narrow corpus of canonical books, and they could have sort of a wider circle of scriptural books. Does that make sense?
Do they mean by scriptural inspired, or do they mean okay?
No. Athanasius never calls Ben Sira inspired. He refers to it as scripture once or twice. But there were debates about that. There were debates about some books as to whether their inspiration would lend them towards that universal recognition, right? That canonical status. To use a New Testament example, Origen of Alexandria, right, roughly 185 to 255, right, is when he lives. Origen, I think it's pretty clear, he held a private opinion on a book called The Shepherd of Hermas. He actually thought the book was divinely inspired. But what's interesting is that he basically says, it is my opinion, and sometimes he'll use the Shepherd of Hermas in theological arguments, and he'll have to be very careful when he cites the shepherd. He'll say, well, if one accepts it. You see what I mean? Yeah. In other words, if one accepts it as an authoritative source for this point, you see. And it's pretty clear Origen realized that he was in the minority. And I know this because in his sermon on Joshua 7.1, Origen goes on to list the 27 books of the New Testament, and the canonical books, and the Shepherd of Hermas is not included. Gotcha. So he holds a private opinion on something like the inspired nature of the shepherd, but when it comes time to okay, what do the churches truly recognize as canon? The shepherd is not amongst those books. So the question is, with a book back to our deuterocanon, right? Like Tobit, I think there were a lot of private opinions, but I think it got more traction than that, though. And then we'll talk about that in a second. But go ahead.
Well, so it seems like the first couple centuries, you have all these Eastern lists, and they don't accept the deuterocanonical books.
Nope.
And then you get to the 4th century, and you have the big showdown.
Yep. That's it.
You got Jerome, you got Augustine, and that seems like it changes everything.
Yeah.
What was that? Can you sketch out what that debate was about and how it affected?
Yeah, for sure. Okay. Yeah, so we come to it now, right? This is the
main event.
The main event. Yeah, no doubt. So I want to so we talked about the Hebrew canon criterion.
Right.
Okay. Eventually, there was another criterion that we call the ecclesiastical or the church acceptance criterion.
Okay.
So in other words, there were some people, some early Christians who said, well, I just look to the Jewish synagogue, and whatever books they have, those are my books. Okay, simple, done. The church acceptance criterion is different. What they do is they look at okay, what are the vast majority of churches accepting as canon? Or Augustine even breaks this down further, like, what are the most authoritative churches accepting as canon, right? Like, he has this whole elaborate description of how the church decides its own books. Okay. How did we get there? There are some early soundings of this, and you can read about this in the Scribes and Scripture chapter on this. But the earliest soundings are probably from a guy like Tertullian in North Africa. He does seem to argue that, well, whatever books are edificatory for the church, those are the ones she accepts. And Tertullian explicitly denies the Hebrew canon criterion. Okay, so Tertullian's one of those guys who just doesn't look at the matter that way. Origen is very debated. But at the end of the day, I think the evidence slightly favors the view that Origen also had a church acceptance criterion driving his canonical views. Okay, I don't want to say much more than that here because it really is elaborate.
It's contested. Okay.
And it's contested.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to put it that way and kind of leave it there. Okay. But all that to say, Augustine isn't he's not inventing the church criterion or the church acceptance criterion of books. That's why I mentioned those other two somewhat, because Augustine makes it very plain. We don't look to the synagogue. We look to see what God has given the churches in terms of books. And when he goes on to list all of the canonical books in 397 AD, he lists what we would call our 39 books of the Old Testament with 6 others. Okay? And those 6 others are not sort of tacked on at the end. Those 6 other books are integrated within all the others. And he seems pretty clear that these are canonical. This list that Augustine drafts was also the one that the Synod of Hippo a few years earlier had adopted, and which the Council of Carthage would go on to adopt in the early part of the 5th century, 399 maybe. Is it 399? But 419, I think, is when Carthage finally kind of finishes up. And then that's the list. This is the history here. This is what they're going to point out. That's the list that winds up in the Council of Florence in the 15th century. And then ultimately, with a change, it's not Trent's list exactly. Trent lists Baruch. Augustine doesn't actually list Baruch. Okay, so there are some differences, but in essence, Trent's list could be traced back to Augustine and that council or synod of Hippo. So Augustine adopted a church acceptance criterion, and then that became kind of the line in the Western Church. But the Western Church is spicier than this, because you've already mentioned Jerome. And as it turns out, not just Jerome. There are earlier Latin fathers like Hilary of Poitiers out in modern day France, but ancient Gaul, okay, who drafted a canon list of Old Testament books around 360 AD, so much earlier than those 2 other guys. And when he lists the Old Testament books, it mirrors the Hebrew canon, you see. Jerome has 3 separate canon lists, each one of them adhering to the Hebrew canon, including no deuterocanonical books. I'm going to come back to what he does with those in a second. And then Rufinus lists the canonical books of the Hebrew canon. He lists the other books in a middle category called ecclesiastical books, books that can be read in church, but not books that we would establish points of doctrine upon. Okay, Rufinus even is pretty clear about this. But anyhow, that debate, that showdown between Augustine and Jerome, basically played itself all the way out through the Middle Ages, and was not even decided until 15. Man, I usually have these dates. What is it? 1544, I think it is the Council of Trent, or 1546 maybe? 1546. that's when they seem to, I say seem because I'll come back to that in a second too. Trent seems to decide Augustine in favor of Augustine.
So up until that point, there were two major streams.
That's right.
You have
There
the
were your
Augustine
followers of
stream.
Augustine
Okay.
and your followers of Jerome. That's right. And it's pretty clear, like in the Middle Ages, like Bede, right? The what, 6th, 7th century scholar Bede, he follows Jerome. I think the Victorines, Hugh of St. Victor, they seem to follow Jerome. I'm trying to remember who of note actually follows Augustine in the Middle Ages.
I saw someone sent me this excerpt from the Catholic Encyclopedia where it had a passing mention that Aquinas even
he might
was back and forth on some of the deuterocanonical books. But that's always I mean, you're mentioning Carthage, and then you go to Florence. I mean, there's all these time between those. But I mean, if they had decided it, I mean, there's also the Council of Rome. I hear that a lot.
We can talk about that, but that's another debated piece as to whether there's a canon list even that came out of the Council of Rome in 382.
Okay.
We have something called the Gelasian Decree, but it's pretty clear that there's some fabrications within our text of the Gelasian Decree, and so there's a little bit of a debate as to whether the list is authentic to the Roman Council or a later appendix. So that's a tricky. You'll see that's why that one's not in our canon list book.
Right. Okay.
So yeah, Ed and I do plan to revise that book in due time, and so there we'll have to deal with Gelasius a bit later. But the reason we didn't include it is because it's still a very disputed point as to whether that canon list belonged to the council or is much later. So,
but even if I guess you granted that, or you have all these councils, why are people still disagreeing in the Middle Ages?
Exactly. And not just the Middle Ages. Here's what I am more certain about. When you get right up to the doorstep of the Reformation, you have Roman Catholic scholar Erasmus still adhering to the Jerome view of the canon. Because I asked that same question. I said, but Erasmus is a Roman Catholic or a Catholic scholar, and he is not interested in deviating from the church on these big questions. That is not his. That is not what he wants. But he's still free to point out that there are differences. Like the church weights the books of the Pentateuch and the Gospels heavier than Tobit and Judith, for example. Like he basically puts the matter that way. Cardinal Cajetan, the cardinal responsible for reviewing Martin Luther's doctrine at the Diet of Augsburg in 1518, Cajetan explicitly lays out the church's adherence to the Hebrew canon, and relegating those other books to he calls it a canon, but what he means by that is a rule for books dealing with like practice and manners, not like he separates them from the doctrinal question,
which Jerome did too.
No, right? So that's why I guess that's my point. Erasmus and Jerome, Erasmus and Cajetan are just parroting Jerome.
I see.
Yeah. So that's the Jerome tradition coming very strongly through. Cardinal Jimenez from Spain, who was the Grand Inquisitor once upon a time. I like to say there's no one really more Catholic than Cardinal Jimenez.
Yeah, you got to be pretty Catholic to do that.
Pretty much. But when it comes time to commenting on the canon, he waxes Jerome. He waxes eloquently on Jerome, and that's his view. So, and that's in 1517 with Jimenez. So in 30 years, when Trent meets, the Grand Inquisitor's canonical view will already be deemed anathema. It'll be deemed accursed, right? That's how Trent. If you don't adhere to this list, and the book forms within this list, let that person be anathema, right? So we're talking about like a 30-year period here where the Grand Inquisitor is now all of a sudden out, right? Because he doesn't hold to the right canon. Okay, so I agree with, I love the way you put that earlier. If it had already been super settled in the Middle Ages, how is it that these Catholics, cardinals in the church, are not on board with Augustine's view?
Did
You
they
see,
die before Trent?
yeah, they were.
Okay,
Yes, yep.
gotcha.
Cajetan's views, in my reading on Trent, Cajetan's views of the canon were reviewed and rejected by the Council of Trent. Yeah,
Okay.
they did not agree with the way he was synthesizing things. So that did happen. Yeah.
So
Yes.
Jerome, it all starts with Jerome though, and he's, you know, he's debating with, I don't know if he's directly debating with Augustine, but at least they're the
Oh
kind of
yeah.
the center of this controversy.
Yeah.
Why did they disagree? I mean, it's funny. Like Augustine, like I feel like as a Protestant and I'm in Reform circles, everyone's like Augustine, yeah, and then
Yeah.
I'm like,
He's our
well,
theological
he
homeboy. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, and then
Yeah.
I'm like, well, yeah, he does think that baptism saves you, and he does think that, and then I see his canon list, and I'm like, oh, what's going on with our boy over here?
I think some of it has to do with Jerome spent a lot of time in Bethlehem. He was in the land, right? I don't think Augustine ever traveled to Israel. So I think there's differences there in terms of their background, their educations. I mentioned Tertullian earlier from North Africa, and of course that's where Augustine is from.
Mm-hmm.
So I do sense that there's a North African tradition on the canon that was adopting more books than the rest of the church, you see, elsewhere. And so Augustine's like North African views, I think, also have to come into play on this. Because it's hard for me to show you that church acceptance criterion outside of North Africa. That's why Origen is kind of significant, because Origen, right, is from Egypt, and he may hold the same or a very similar view, though debated. But so in other words, geography wouldn't account for all of that. But I do think Tertullian, Augustine, that is a clear connection to the wider canon coming out. As soon as Augustine and the Synod of Hippo, I should add this, the Synod of Hippo, kind of a rule, I guess, on the canon. Pope Innocent I picks up that same list and includes it in one of his letters,
Okay.
which becomes my terminology is failing me, but those letters, of course, are adopted into the church's canon law.
Okay.
They're not as high up.
Encyclical or
Yeah, it's something like that. But I
okay.
think that's more the eastern
Okay.
side. But
Gotcha.
these decretals,
Okay.
the Pope's decretals, they started off as these letters, but then they take on a decretal status in the canon law of the church. They're not viewed, right, as authoritative as a conciliar decision, but they're still weighted. Okay, so and that's around 400 AD. Okay, so that, I think, creates a momentum for that side of the Western Church's canonical views. Okay, but it's still fascinating that it was still not strong enough to stamp out the Jerome view. Those were allowed to exist side by side. Now, it's interesting about Trent. Last thing about this.
Yeah.
Trent, we now know, because the notebooks, the journals, the minutes have all been opened up. The Vatican has allowed researchers to finally look at those within the last maybe 70 years, 80 years. So this is kind of recent.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's a recent thing. And we're learning that that certain prelates at the Council of Trent stood up and said, hey, we're not here to decide between what reputable theologians have said on this question, right? Like Augustine and Jerome. Like who do we think we are that we're going to decide who was right on this?
Yeah.
So what's interesting is we now know the Italian name, the prelate's name is Banuccio. So he stood up and actually made this statement, and apparently everyone in the room agreed. Yeah, you're right. Who are we? We're not gonna decide between Augustine and Jerome here. And what's fascinating is when Trent publishes their decree on the canon, there's no hint of that qualification. It's just, it's totally left out. But we can go back and read that they had accepted this qualification. In other words, I don't think they wanted a particular view of the canon to become an entrenched part of their DNA. I think, according to some of these Jesuit historians that I'm reading on Trent, I think they actually wanted to keep the healthy debate going. I don't think they wanted to decide it once and for all. But no matter what, though, the decree looked more like Augustine. And a year later, John Calvin, in his Antidotes to Trent, he actually comments on what Trent has done. Like, he just read the decree, and he said, well, they've obviously decided. They've changed the chalk lines, is what he says. They've redrafted what the canon of Scripture is.
So it seemed like the early church adopted that Hebrew criterion.
Yeah.
And
that's
so
the earliest evidence.
And so if you're talking to them, you're talking to the early church guys, they're just like, and I think also what's been helpful is, and I think you've mentioned this in your book, if you have the category of helpful but not canonical,
right,
or a broader sense of people use canon in different ways, then, for example, when like First Clement quotes Judith, you're like, oh, this is, but it's an edification. It's like she's an example.
Exactly.
Right, which is exactly what the second tier of you would expect.
Absolutely. And if you look at that passage in First Clement, what is it, 54 and 55? If you read those, Esther's included as well there. It's Esther and Judith together, but Clement's point there is not to talk about them as Scripture at all.
Right.
He's just talking about them as examples of piety.
Right.
In the way that they I've looked at that passage pretty closely on a number of occasions, and I'm convinced Clement's not making any statements about canon or Scripture even there. We have these women that we can look to as great examples of godliness. So I just explained the Clement thing a little bit differently. Clement is not pretending to give us any kind of statement on Scripture or canon. All that vocabulary is not included there.
I'm trying to figure out how to ask this with so Jerome has his famous preface, I think, to Samuel and Kings, and
that's right.
Where he's basically saying,
helmeted prologue.
Right, and he's basically saying look, I'm supposed to translate this, just so you know, the Hebrews don't accept, the deuterocanonical books. I don't, but translate it, and so, but what that means is that there was an expectation. It seems like at his time there was a debate. And it seems like Augustine affirms that because he's saying some aren't accepted by all churches, So prior to that, there's debate over the canon. It seems like the Hebrew criteria would have solved that. If they're all like, look, that's what the Jews have, that's what we'll take. It seems like either the Hebrew canon wasn't that universally accepted, or it dissolved over time very quickly.
So, I guess that's what I mean. Let's back up a couple steps here.
Yeah.
I can show you Tertullian around 200 AD. That's early.
Yeah.
Rejecting the Hebrew canon criterion.
Okay,
it's
so
not
I see. Yeah.
It's not universally accepted. But of those who reject the Hebrew canon criterion, they are located mainly to North Africa.
I see.
Yes.
I see.
I just want to be clear about that.
And the guys closest to people to the Jews who would know are the
more
ones
Hebrew
who
canon,
including Okay.
But Hilary of Poitiers is in France.
Yeah,
adhering primarily to the Hebrew canon criterion.
Right.
So I would say that in terms of geographical distribution, I think that's the default. It's not the universal, but it is the default setting when it comes to what canon the Christians should receive.
Do you think Augustine knew that the Hebrew canon didn't have those books? Like, did he just read Jerome's stuff and go like, oh, okay, and but I don't care? Or like, how did he interact with Jerome?
Yeah, he knew that. He knew that. Yeah. They interacted mainly on the translation issue.
Okay,
So to complicate things a little bit,
great.
Augustine accessed the Bible through a Latin translation of that Greek translation of the Hebrew. So something called the Vetus Latina, or the Old Latin, is the way Augustine read the Bible. I mean, it's like a translation of a translation, you see.
Mm-hmm.
Jerome knew that, and so Jerome, of course, his project in what we call the Latin Vulgate is to go directly back to the Hebrew source, what he called the Hebrew truth. Okay, and he said the Hebraica Veritas. He said, I'm going to translate into Latin directly from the Hebrew, you see, and I'm going to remove all of the middle steps. So that, as you can imagine, that revealed a lot of differences between the Hebrew and that Greek translation of the Septuagint. Okay, so that's where Augustine and Jerome mainly battled, was on that.
Okay, and then the canon's like a subset of that.
Yeah, because Augustine, yes, exactly. And again, Jerome, because he had an intermediate view of those books, they were neither canon nor were they apocrypha. They weren't dangerous or heretical writings. Though he does call them apocrypha, right? One time.
Okay.
Calls those 6 books apocrypha. But later on, he does come back and say, no, they're good for edification. So I think he knew what he was doing when he used that word apocrypha, because it's really pejorative.
Uh-huh.
It's like the label you give to something that you just want to not mess with, right, or deal with. You just call it apocrypha. But he comes back and he has a more sober view of them later. They're an intermediate, right? The 6 deuterocanonical books, they're edificatory. They're not for the establishing of doctrine. That's what the canon books do. And they're not heretical or apocryphal. Okay, they're in the middle. Jerome still translates those middle tier books. He translates Tobit and Judith, and he has a preface for them as well. And he tells us he does so because Judith is a great example of virtue.
Sure.
And we can read this book that way. But he's super clear. We would not go to these books for doctrine. Yeah.
So Augustine, he had a dog in the fight because his translation is based off of a Greek translation that he wants to defend, and tied to that is what I guess he assumed that Greek translation also included these other books.
Right. Yeah, I think so. But interestingly though, he knows. He says this in the City of God. He knows that the 70 translators worked during the time of King Ptolemy II in Egypt. And he has the right dates for Ptolemy. It's like the early part of the 3rd century BC.
Okay.
And when he's talking about the books of Maccabees, he knows that 1st and 2nd Maccabees are like late 2nd, 1st century BC. So how did the 70 translators translate 1st and 2nd Maccabees? So he doesn't actually he does not make a tight connection either between the 70 and the canon. He knows chronologically that doesn't work. So, and that's, I think, the important thing, right? Again, there is no such thing as a Septuagint canon.
Right.
And I think the ancients also knew that. Modern Septuagint scholars are the ones guilty of promoting the Septuagint as a corpus of books. And I think that's a problem. Let me show you something. Here's a modern edition of Septuaginta. Notice he's got it spelled right with the Latin. But I don't know if you ever looked through this, Brian. There's some books in here. It's interesting. They're your kind of classical books, but then books like 3rd Maccabees, 4th Maccabees, 4 Maccabees. I don't think there's a branch of the Christian tradition that holds 4 Maccabees as canonical. Not a single one. Okay. More interestingly, when we get to the book of Psalms in here, in this thing called the Septuagint, here we are. Let's see. Yes. As a part of the Greek version of the Psalms, much, much later, there were some odes or hymns that were added to the end. Do you know that, let's see here, one of them, yes, one of them is entitled Prasuke Marias Tes Theotaku, the prayer of Mary, the God-bearer. And it's her Magnificat from Luke chapter 2.
Huh.
In the Septuagint?
Right.
So modern Septuagint scholars have seen this corpus grow, you see.
Because
But
Jews
there's
would
no,
not have translated that. Yeah.
No, of course
Yeah.
not.
They would
Of
definitely.
course not. No, this is the widest possible line you could draw. Okay,
Yeah.
on
Yeah.
what is included in the Septuagint, but
Yeah.
they're using, but to Alfred Rolf's credit, they're using ancient Christian manuscripts as they compile this. And
Right.
somewhere along the way, ancient Christian scribes thought it'd be really cool to add a lengthy appendix of odes or hymns to Israel's collection of hymns and psalms. Do you see that?
Yeah.
But there's no way that comes from a Jewish tradition. That's a much, much later Christian development.
Right.
So you would never call that as a result of the 70, right? So if you're going to define the Septuagint corpus in its widest possible parameters, you would look to something like this. If you're going to actually follow the earliest historical sources, the word 70 is attached only to Genesis to Deuteronomy by the letter of Aristeas, Philo of Alexandria, Josephus, and even the earliest Jewish rabbis. Okay, so anyone who wants to argue just simply, well, the Septuagint had these books, I would say, yes, but it also had a lot of other books that no one's ever thought was canon.
Right.
Yeah.
This is a fascinating deep dive. Thank you so much. I mean, maybe in conclusion, just thinking about these books. I mean, I've been working my way reading through them,
Yes,
and a lot of them are edifying.
They are.
And even Protestant Bibles around the time of Reformation had them. They just had them, sectioned off. And I even think some Lutheran and Anglican traditions still will have them as supplementary readings. So
the Anglicans still have them as part of their lectionary.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah. So
Yep.
maybe if we pull back from the sort of the Protestant Catholic debates about it,
Yep.
and we just look at this section of books, how should we view them today?
Yeah. So I read them more carefully when it comes to doctrine, right?
Right.
But I still think these books, just like Jerome said, they can be read for edification. Just a quick example. In 2 Maccabees chapter 7, there's a mother and her 6 sons who are being tortured by King Antiochus Epiphanes IV. Okay,
It's pretty brutal too. It's
super brutal.
Yeah.
They're like getting close and close to this like frying pan kind of thing. Like it's atrocious, right? But when I read that chapter, right, because they're basically, the king gives them a simple test. Are you going to obey me and eat pig's flesh, or are you going to face torture unto death, right? That's the thing. And the whole chapter unfolds with the mother just encouraging the sons. Look, you'll die, yes, but if you die faithful to God and in fear of God, you will be raised again. Like there's a strong chapter on the resurrection of the body, actually. It's a fascinating chapter for lots of reasons. But I read that, not about its resurrection piece, though historically that's interesting. I read that, though, and I go, wow, if these Jewish martyrs will die for the law, when put to the test, will I die for Christ when I'm put to the test? Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, if I substitute Christ for the law here, I can actually benefit from their examples of piety here. And I would never ever build a doctrine of martyrdom based on this text. That's not what I'm suggesting. But I just read it and I go, man, this is virtue. This is true fear of God here. Okay. And not the fear of man. And these guys are willing to die for the law. And I kind of, as a Christian, right, I smile at that. But then I have to quickly ask myself, but would I be willing to die for Christ in this kind of temptation or trial? Does that make sense? So that's a way in which I've come to read these books as edificatory, right? As building up, right? My faith. But I will not base my faith or a point of the faith upon these books. I won't do it because only a select few Christians have ever done that, you see. And that's why I'm...
Yeah, I mean, it makes me think too, like, you could do worse on supplemental literature. I mean, I'm
For sure.
Actually, you know what? Read Wisdom of Solomon over whatever evangelical bestseller right now. I mean,
that's
maybe
correct.
This would be more edifying.
Correct. That's correct. Yeah, I'm with you. And even on the ancient palette, right? That we're not talking about something like the Gospel of Thomas here.
Sure.
That's, I mean, which clearly had some sort of Gnostic kind of, overtones. We're talking about books that I think, for the most part, would be consistent with Jewish theology. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
It clearly amplifies things. We can find the resurrection in the Hebrew Bible, can't we? Right? It's grounded in these verses, right? Where, right, Yahweh is the one who kills and makes alive, right? So we know that the resurrection is in text of the Old Testament. But when I come to something like 2 Maccabees 7, I do see an amplification, right, of something that's already there. Okay. But in 2 Maccabees 12, 43 to 46, this is where Judas Maccabee wants to offer prayers for the dead Jewish soldiers. This is where the purgatory doctrine eventually comes from. What's interesting is that in 2 Maccabees 12, his practice of praying for the dead, I find that nowhere else, Brian. There's not even a seed of that in any of the Hebrew canonical books. In fact, the narrator of 2 Maccabees 12, he kind of goes through a bit more description of what Judas is doing here. Because there's no prior tradition or prior teaching to base this on. So, in other words, I almost feel like the author of Maccabees is saying, this is new. There's no foundation for this. Okay. So, plus, there's so many things we could talk about. We just, the fact that First Maccabees says, right, there's not a single prophet amongst the community, right? So it's an implicit way of saying First and Second Maccabees weren't inspired, right? Because they weren't written by a prophet. So anyhow, there's lots of things we could talk about that our Roman Catholic friends find interesting, I'm sure. But
yeah, and I hope it's a friendly debate, and I think but it's a great thing to look into, and I find with so many subjects, you start reading because you want an answer to one question, and then it opens up whole new vistas of understanding the church and understanding, the way that these doctrines have been talked about and all that kind of stuff. And so it's a great deep dive. And But this was a fun conversation. Thank you, John, so much for this. We're going to put some links to your books so people can check out those resources.
Right.
And just appreciate your scholarship in this area. And thank
Yeah.
you for taking the time to talk with us about this subject.
Yeah. Thanks, Brian, for having me on.